Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of Talking Chaos. I'm your host, Johnny Chaos. Now I'm gonna talk in my normal voice. Hi, I'm Johnny Chaos, and this is the very first episode of Talking Chaos. I hope you enjoy it. You're probably wondering if you didn't already hear the trailer. This is going to be a podcast where we mainly talk about anything and everything, and we're not afraid to offend anyone. So if you're a sensitive person, I'm going to warn you now that this show might not be for you. So in this very first episode, we are going to talk about the docuseries Quiet on the Set, the Darkside of Kids TV. So this show's about producer Dan Schneider. Dan Schneider was a TV producer for Nickelodeon for over 20 years. He produced and created shows like Zoe 101, Drake and Josh, and many more. During his time with Nickelodeon, he became one of the most well-known names on the network. But what happened on his shows behind the scenes would eventually become the end of his career. Nickelodeon dominated U.S. children's television at the start of the millennium, with many of its most popular shows created and produced by one man, Dan Schneider. Awards came his way, along with personal stardom not usually offered to children's TV showrunners. This meant he became untouchable. Since his departure from Nickelodeon in 2018, after a lot of criticism about toxic working environments on Schneider's shows, people have said that he was sexist, cruel, and slightly racist. Quiet on the Set adds to the case against Schneider, laying out a long list of allegations including humiliating female employees and maintaining relationships with child actors that were either not sympathetic enough if the child did not win his favor or too friendly if the child did. Children were asked to perform material laced with what now looks like crass sexual innuendo. If you're like me, you grew up watching these shows. And I remember as far back as, watching All That, which was one of the very first shows he produced with Nickelodeon. And to go back and see that this stuff was happening, we didn't know that kind of stuff was happening back then. Kids didn't know about any of this stuff. And to find out about it so many years later, it's mind-blowing. It's like, wow, this happened, these kids just wanted to be kids and start a career to make other kids laugh, they probably started their careers thinking, this is going to be a great career. I'm going to get to do what I love, making other kids laugh. And then this shit happens, and it's, wow. It's sad, really. It is. It's just a loss of words, really. Like, you look at actors like what happened to Drake Bell, and you're like, wow. Because a situation like that it's life-changing. It changes everything. It changes the way these people look at life, and they can't ever really recover from that. That's not something you ever come back from. And when you see the episode of that show where Drake is talking about what happened to him and what he experienced, you can tell that it's hard for him to talk about. And this is the first time he's publicly told anyone on television. And it's one of the most difficult things that he's probably ever had to talk about in his entire life. And to know that, he's kept it secret for years. A lot of people that worked with him on the set of all that didn't even know all that happened, Not until that docuseries came out. It's very sad. Going back and looking at these shows that Dan Schneider produced, you go back and you realize, how did this stuff even air with all this stuff going on behind the scenes? It's, how did this network get these shows out there, And a lot of people talk about the fact that Dan Schneider was basically the king of Nickelodeon. He had complete control of the network, and because of that, he was untouchable. Nickelodeon did not want to fire him for the longest time because they knew if they got rid of him, Disney would pretty much take over the realm of kids comedy. And Nickelodeon didn't really want to take that chance. So they risked it. They took a huge risk and just decided to go with it. And I guess they just hoped for the best. And it worked, because he was on Nickelodeon for over 20 years. And it's just like, wow. And like I said at the time, if you grew up with these shows, you didn't know what was going on. But the man, when it came to comedy, he was a genius. There was a lot of sexual jokes. But besides that, you never really knew what else was going on, because everything else happened off camera. And if I had known what had happened to Drake back then, and then started watching Drake and Josh, if I had known all that, I might not have watched it. Because to know that and then watch that show, it would have been hard to watch it and it still be funny, knowing what happened. Because, if you watch the docuseries, Drake was talking about how, around the time that this happened, Drake and Josh wasn't even a show yet. Dan and Drake and the network had been talking about it at the time, but the show wasn't being filmed yet. This was around the time that all that was wrapping up. It was in its final season, and I think sometime before that show had ended, Dan was talking to Drake about doing another show, or either that or it was the network talking to Dan about him producing another show for Nickelodeon. And he had pitched this idea about Drake and Josh because when Drake and Josh were both on All That, the fans really loved the duo. And they said, they would be the perfect stars for a new teen comedy. And, that was kind of the idea. And they started working on the show. And this was probably about a year after the show was pitched. The man, Brian Peck, which has no relation to Josh Peck, by the way. His trial for what he did to Drake was starting. And this was about, I think they had said this was about 3 weeks before they had started filming for Drake and Josh. And, Drake talks about, what he had to say in this courtroom and point out, who did this to him and everything. And he said it was so surreal for the fact that Brian Peck had so many supporters that didn't want him to go to prison. And a lot of them were there, and, for the ones that weren't there, that couldn't make it to the hearing, a lot of the letters they were writing to him came up in court, and it was just unreal. Drake said that it was unreal that Brian Peck had so much support for what he had done. And that, people were okay with this. That blew Drake's mind, let alone the experience itself. I think it opened up his eyes to what Hollywood was. Hollywood wasn't just a way to become famous, but it started to seem like it was a way that if you were famous enough, you were above the law. Or if you worked in Hollywood in any realm, even if you weren't on the camera, you were above the law. And for a long time, you were, in Hollywood. A lot of people would do stuff and get away with it, and nowadays that's not quite the case. I would say that there's still people in Hollywood that do end up getting away with stuff that shouldn't. But I think that the government lately, in the last couple of years, has gotten more involved with Hollywood. And that's a good thing, especially with kids' TV. Do background checks on the entire crew that's working on the show. Check in every once in a while and see what's going on the show. That's what should be. That's what should have happened back then. If that had been happening back then, you look at Drake's case. If that had happened back then none of this would have ever happened. It's just amazing to see how much better things could have been. It's sad what happened to Drake, and, to look back at everything he's done now, and to know that it's different, it's never something you can go back. Like now, I don't think I could ever go back and watch Drake and Josh the same way, or, any of the shows he did. It's going to be completely different now. So during the time of all that, in the docuseries they talk about, I think it was during the first 2 seasons, Dan Schneider had these 2 female writers on the show. I think the one woman, this was her very first job in Hollywood as a writer. She had no previous experience, but she was very excited to work on this show and kickstart her writing career. Well, apparently, Dan Schneider was very sexist. He honestly did not like the idea of having any females in the writing room. And whenever these 2 women were in the writing room, they, on the docuseries, they talked about how very uncomfortable it was to work with Dan. The sexual jokes he made. The other woman eventually ended up finding out that Dan was actually underpaying her. And she ended up calling the corporate office about her pay. And when she did this, Dan Schneider called her the next day and said, "Did you threaten me?" And she was terrified when Dan called her. She didn't know what to think, but am I going to get fired for this? Or, what's going to happen? Is this the end of my career? And Dan realized that he didn't have much say in this once, she caught on to her pay and all that, and she had called corporate, so he just ended up giving her what she was supposed to already have. So she ended up being okay. She ended up staying, as far as I know, with another year at least on the show. The other woman, the one that was new to Hollywood, she also found out about her pay not being right. And there's this one day in the office where, everybody was in the writing room, and I think Dan had made some kind of sexual joke about her bending over the table. And because she was so afraid to get fired and lose this career, that she risked it all and just took the joke serious, and she bent over the table and was laughing with Dan. The other woman just felt completely uncomfortable. And apparently after all this happened, the woman that was bending over the table said, she was very uncomfortable with it, but she only went with it to keep her job. But as time went on, it only got worse. And the 2 women ended up leaving within a year. So by the end of the 2nd season, they had both left. And according to the one woman, she had said in the docuseries, she thinks if it was up to Dan, she would have never had the job in the first place, because, she thought Dan was so sexist against women that, if it was up to him, obviously the network hired people. He wasn't in charge of hiring people, but he was in charge of the shows. But if it was up to him, he probably never would have hired these 2 women in the writing room. And the woman had said, that scares me, that he could have had that much power. And then, so we know that Dan was sexist. He was also slightly racist. There was this kid he came in late on the show. I think he was on like the 7th season or whatever of all that. The show only ran for 8 seasons. Or he might have been on the final season. I don't remember which season it was. I know he came in late. But, this kid was, African American. His mother, the entire time that he was on the show, the mom knew a lot of the stuff that was going on in the show. And I'm not just talking about behind the camera, but like what she actually saw in the show that her child was doing. She could tell that, Dan was slightly racist. I think there was an episode where her son was playing a fetus in one of the skits, and Dan had him wearing a bodysuit, that was his skin color. And, his mom had seen that on the show and was like, what is this about? And the kid even talked about, like, this just didn't seem right, like I get that it was part of the skit, but like, I was wearing a bodysuit that was my skin tone, and it seemed a little off that this was the joke, And he said he felt very uncomfortable about it, and that wasn't the only time. There would be multiple times on the show that he would feel uncomfortable, or his mom would feel uncomfortable about what was going on. So after this season had wrapped, his mom ended up pulling him from the show. He said at the time he was kind of mad at his mom about pulling him from the show, but when he looks back at it, years later, he realized that, maybe she did the right thing. Maybe she saw things that I wasn't seeing at the time. And luckily for him, he didn't see what was coming next, because Dan's reign got worse as time went on. Things only went further downhill. So now I'm going to start talking about Brian Peck. I talked a little bit about him in one of the other segments. So Brian Peck, again, no relation to Josh Peck. But Brian Peck was an acting and voice coach that mainly worked around the time that all that was still filming. And, he knew a lot of the kids on set, and he knew Drake Bell. So at the time, when all this was going on, Joe Bell, Drake Bell's father, was his manager. Was Drake's manager. He managed all the shows he did and, whatever gigs he had at the time. Well, Joe wasn't a big fan of Brian. Brian was always touching on all the other kids, and Joe always felt that wasn't right. Something felt wrong about that. And, he had noticed that he was doing the same to Drake. And he eventually, went to somebody in the studio and said, this feels a little odd. He's always touching on all the kids. And, Joe had said, well, what's up with that? And he was talking to one of the females. I guess they worked for HR or something, or she was just the receptionist for the studio or something. But she had said, well, Brian's gay. And then, at that point, Joe had just thought, okay, well, maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's not anything else. But, boy, would he later find out how wrong he was. So Brian had talked to Drake about, him possibly being Drake's new manager. Brian had talked to Drake and told him that his dad was kind of dragging him down, to his true potential. And, Brian had said, if I'm your manager, I'll get you on, the biggest shows that you want to be on. I can get you anywhere in this career. So, Drake listened to him and, eventually confronted his dad and told his dad that I don't want you to be my manager anymore. I want Brian to be my manager. And, Joe wasn't happy about this. He didn't like the idea of Brian being his son's new manager. It broke his heart, too, to see that Drake didn't want his own father to be his manager anymore. But, Joe didn't want to upset Drake, so he ended up just letting Brian be Drake's new manager. So as Drake's new manager, after school, Drake would go over to Brian's house, and Brian would start coaching him for his show. And this happened every couple days, maybe not every day, but, common enough that it, Joe did not like the idea of Drake always going to Brian's house by himself. And eventually this got to a point to where Brian was taking advantage of Drake. I'm not going to get into all the details of that. I think you know what I mean by that. And that's when things started to get really dark for Drake. And, this goes on for, months. And one day, Drake's over at his girlfriend's house. And, he's sitting there with his girlfriend and, her mom. And the phone keeps ringing. So, the mom answers it and says, "It's for you, Drake, someone named Brian." And, he just says, "Oh, just hang it up. It's not a big deal. I can talk to him later. I know who it is." And she's like, okay. So she ends up hanging up the phone. And the phone just keeps ringing and ringing. And it's the same number that keeps calling. So eventually the girlfriend's mom takes Drake into the kitchen. And she says, "What's going on?" And Drake says, "Well, what do you mean?" And, she says, "Well, this 40-year-old guy keeps calling my daughter's boyfriend, and it doesn't seem normal that he keeps calling." So then he ends up telling his girlfriend's mom what's going on. And when this happens, she calls Drake's mom and explains to her what is going on. So then all this unfolds, and when his mom finds out, the FBI gets involved. So now it's this whole big thing, and now, Drake's mind is racing. He has no idea what to think at this point. He's only 15. And his whole world is just completely upside down right now. And so he ends up starting to talk to the FBI, and he's telling them what's going on. And this whole investigation starts. And it's very unsettling for him to talk about Brian and to talk in exact detail of what happened. But he tells them, and they tell Drake, we're gonna bug the phone, and we want you to call him so we can get his confession, basically. So, they end up bugging the phone, and, Drake ends up calling Brian, and I think he had said something like, can you meet me somewhere, or maybe, I can't remember the exact details of what was said, but the FBI ends up arresting Brian Peck, and it's in all the papers. Now he's known as this child molester, but no one knows who the victim is. It was never in the papers, who it was. All that was ever said that, Brian Peck, child molester, now in prison. That was it. No one ever knew who it was, And Drake made sure it stayed that way for many, many years. His dad didn't even know for a long time. His dad ended up calling him one day, and this was sometime after, I think, actually, it might have been after Brian was arrested. But his dad ends up calling him, and he's like, what's going on? I heard something happened at the studio. And Drake's like, yeah, Brian Peck just got arrested. And Joe's relieved to hear that. He says, oh my God, finally, this happened. He said, I knew something was up with that guy, and I'm glad he got arrested before anything happened to you. And, Drake, at that point, he didn't tell his dad that it was him. But he was like, yeah, I'm glad he got arrested too, Dad. He could not work up the courage to tell his dad. It wasn't until years after that he would eventually tell his dad, and when he did, it broke his dad's heart to hear that. I can only imagine how that conversation went. Wow. It's really sad. Nothing like that should have to happen to anyone. It's just, a loss of words, really. And like I said, when you see Drake talking about this in the docuseries, you can tell it's one of the most difficult things that he's ever had to talk about in his entire life. And it's just unreal. It really is. So now we're going to talk about Jeanette McCurdy. So if you don't know who Jeanette McCurdy is, she played Sam Puckett on iCarly and in the spinoff series Sam and Cat. So Jeanette McCurdy ended up leaving Nickelodeon not long after the Sam and Cat show started, The show didn't do very well with viewers, and I think it ended up getting canceled after the first season or something. I don't know. I didn't really watch that one, so I'm not really sure what happened with that show. But what I do know about the actress, she ended up leaving Nickelodeon because she had... Now, she wasn't in the docuseries at all, but she was mentioned. And she, sometime after she had left Nickelodeon, I do remember her writing a book. She wrote a book about her career and her mother. She had a very rocky relationship with her mother. And the book was titled, "I'm Glad My Mother Is Dead." And I remember it popping up a lot on Amazon. It was just one of the biggest books at the time. And I want to say this was back in 2018 or 19 that she released this book. And it goes into a lot of detail about her time working with Dan Schneider. And out of a lot of the actors on the show, she might have been one of the only ones that saw a lot of the stuff that was going on behind the scenes. And, she didn't like it, And, she had always talked about, why are we doing this? Why is this happening? And she eventually leaves the show. And she talks about in the book a lot about how, she never wanted to get on Dan's bad side because she didn't want to get fired. But at the same time, she didn't like the way he acted. He was very cruel. If you didn't do what he said, or if you didn't like what he said, he would let you know. But if you could get on his good side and made him laugh, you were golden. You didn't have to worry about losing your job. But if you ever got on his bad side, that's when you'd get worried. And, Dan, with a lot of the female actresses on the shows, he would touch them a lot. And, Jeanette wasn't all about that. And what's crazy is a lot of people don't even know about this, but Jerry Trainer, so Jerry played the brother on iCarly. He played Spencer Shay, Carly Shay's older brother on the show. But off camera, he really did play the big brother because whenever Dan wanted the kids to do something that seemed inappropriate, Jerry would scream at Dan and say, "No, we're not doing this." And, Jerry was really the only one that would stand up to Dan. Everybody else, especially the kids, would just do whatever he said for the fact that they were afraid that, they would lose their career. But Jerry said, "No, fuck that. We're not doing this." Literally yelling at Dan. And, it's like, wow, out of anybody on the crew or even on the cast, Jerry seemed to be the only one that truly cared about the kids and saw what was happening. And I think in Jeanette's book, I think she even mentioned that. And yeah, it makes you think, was Jerry the only person that ever had any sense on any of Dan's shows? And I'm sure if Jerry had the power to talk to the executives of the network, he would have had Dan fired back then. iCarly premiered around 2007. So this was about halfway through Dan's rule of Nickelodeon. At this point, he had been running the entire network for about 10 years at this point. So it's like, even if, you think about, even if Jerry had talked to the executives, after Dan being in control for, 10 years, would it really have mattered? Would the executives have really listened to Jerry? Because you think about it, and it's like, like I said before, Disney was starting to do a lot of kid sitcoms around the same time, and you had really successful ones like The Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, Hannah Montana, Wizards of Waverly Place. A lot of these shows were coming out around the same time that iCarly did. And, Dan Schneider was the king of Nickelodeon, especially by this point. And I think that executives of Nickelodeon, they knew this, and they didn't want to take the risk of losing their ratings just because of stuff that was happening behind the scenes. They wanted to compete big with Disney Channel. And they weren't going to take this risk. So that makes me think, Jerry might not have stood a chance trying to talk to them about what was happening. And they probably already knew. Maybe not about everything, but I'm sure they knew. But that didn't matter to them. It didn't matter to them. It's pretty clear, especially with all of this going on for 20 years. So now we're going to talk about the end of Dan Schneider's career with Nickelodeon. So in 2018, Nickelodeon had finally talked about what all was going on with, everything that happened over the years behind the scenes on all of Dan Schneider's shows. So, you're talking about, you had 2 child molesters, and then you talk about how sexist and racist and how cruel that Dan Schneider was against crew members. And, you had so many people that would talk about how uncomfortable they felt working with Dan Schneider because, of his sense of sexual jokes on a kid's show. It just didn't fit. And the fact that he got away with it a lot of times, it's just like, wow. And then you look at, I said, with the child molesters, you look at that and you hope that nowadays, executives look more into, who are we hiring at our studio? And they are now. Way more than what they did back then. But it's still odd that after all that happened and they kept Dan around for over 20 years. Like, that's mind-blowing. Like, no one stopped to think, wait a minute. Dan worked with these people for years before any of this happened. And it's like, now mind you, these two molesters, they had no previous records, so it's not like they were hired and, a background check was made and, nothing popped up because they were first-time offenders. So it's not like, they were hired on the spot and people already knew what was going on. No. They were first-time offenders and no one knew what was going on until after they got arrested, But it definitely does make you think. 'Cause that's the thing. People say, well, they should be doing background checks. Okay, but what if these people are first-time offenders? Then that's not going to be a thing. And, people don't look at that. Now, I'm not making excuses for anybody whatsoever, but at the same time, I think you get what I'm saying. You can't... There's never going to be 100% guarantee that you can keep these kids on these shows safe. But if, you can do... maybe what needs to happen, and I think, like I said, I think it is now, but they need to do a more in-depth interview with these people. Like, you do your background check, and then, maybe you ask these people questions about a certain situation and ask them what they would do in those situations and kind of get an idea of who they are. Like, what would you do in this situation if this happened? How would you react to it? And, I think if you did something like that, you can kind of figure out, like, okay, so based on your answer, you're this kind of person. And even then, it's still not 100% guarantee, but it's something. It would definitely put more people at ease about who's being hired in the studios, and to make sure these kids are safe. If they did something like that, that would be great. But like I said, it only guarantees so much. But yeah, so Nickelodeon talks to Dan, and they're like, look, we're done with you. We tried to brush all this under the rug for the last 20 years, and we just can't keep doing it anymore. And so Dan basically tells them, like, look, you'll never get anyone as good as me to work for you again. He said, once I'm gone, Nickelodeon will just trickle down as a memory. And, he was very proud of himself. He thought that without him, Nickelodeon just really couldn't continue to be a popular network. And, I also want to mention that, Dan Schneider had nothing to do with this docuseries. He was in no way involved. They did talk about him a lot, but he was in no way involved with the show. And I think if he was, he would have turned a lot of the stuff around that was said about him. And he would have made himself out to look like the good guy. And it would have broken what the show was trying to do, what it was trying to show people about, what was happening back then. And, obviously, Dan Schneider's career is not just over with Nickelodeon, but, his career is pretty much over in Hollywood altogether. He'll never be a writer again, and if he does, it hopefully it's not on a kid's show, if anything. But yeah, who knows? And hopefully a lot of the people that were involved in all this stuff, hopefully they, if they're still working in Hollywood somewhere, hopefully they've reevaluated the way they're pursuing their careers. Because it's like at some point, someone should have stepped up and said something. Because like I said in the last segment, Jerry seemed to be the only one that would really speak up against Dan. And that's a good thing. In my book, Jerry is the good guy. He was the one looking out for the kids. He's overall the hero in this story. So this is the end of the very first episode of Talking Chaos. So, like I said before in the trailer, we're going to talk a little bit about anything and everything. So, if there's something you want me to talk about for episode 2, let me know. It can be about anything. For the first episode, I picked the Darkside of kids TV because the docuseries has become so popular because, a lot of people are talking about it and, how bad that situation was for a lot of those kids. And, I figured, well, there's so many people talking about it, maybe I should make it my first episode and, kind of talk about it in a way that, I felt about it because I grew up watching all those shows, not so much some of the later ones like, Sam and Cat and, whatever came out after that, if there was any shows that came out after that. But anyway, I watched some of the earlier ones, like All That, Zoe 101, Drake and Josh, I watched a lot of those growing up. And, Drake and Josh was one of my favorites out of all the shows that Dan Schneider made. And like I said, to go back and watch that stuff and to know what all happened, it's mind-blowing. It changes the way that I will forever look at those shows now. It's scary and sad to know that all that happened. And, they make it look so, glamorous to be a child star in Hollywood. But then you see the stuff like this and you realize it's not all what it's made to look like, It's not easy. It's not a dream for everyone. In some cases, maybe it is what it looks like. But that's not always the case. A lot of times, it's a lot darker than, what you're seeing on the shows that these kids are doing. And this isn't just Dan Schneider. There's other shows. You look at some of the stuff that happened on Disney Channel, and it's a lot of the same stuff. It doesn't matter what network we're talking about or what producer we're talking about. It can happen to any kid on any network, anywhere. So, keep that in mind. Because I'm sure at some point, maybe we'll see a documentary about something that happened on Disney Channel back then. that we didn't know happened. And then you're going to be like, oh my God, that happened. And, I grew up watching that. So yeah, just, keep that in mind. Yeah, so, just let me know what you think about this first episode, and, you can kind of give me ideas on what I should do for my second episode. It could be, we could talk about another show, or it could be a movie, or just anything that's currently going on in the world right now. Whatever. But yeah, that's it, guys, for my first episode. I will return with a second episode here soon. I will keep you updated. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned.